All right, welcome back. We are covering the Road to Conflict Part 2. In Part 1, we talked a lot about the French and Indian War, and you should remember that the knock-on effects of the French and Indian War are basically that taxes went up and colonists were upset. They were upset about the taxes. They were also upset at the proclamation line of 1763. So what we've got here is some more kind of exciting events colonists are going to get a little more agitated about. Um, and so a couple things. These are kind of like vocab terms that you're going to see again. The first one we have here is the writs of assistance. Um, this was a super annoying thing that colonists really hated. But the British, trying to make sure that the taxes were being collected, basically just passed a law saying that if you owned a ship, the British government could just pull up next to you with their ship, and then they could board without your permission and search your ship. And if they found any contraband, they would take it. But what this kind of devolved into was like the British government basically just boarding people's ships, taking stuff that wasn't even contraband, like the smuggled stuff that we talked about in Unit 1, Section 1, and people just losing like thousands and thousands of dollars to the British government. It would be kind of like the equivalent of a police officer pulling you over, asking you to step out of the vehicle, and then taking your groceries out of your car. That's kind of what was going on. And colonists, all they could do is complain. The British government said, well, this is a law now, so you got to follow it. Another big thing that really upset the colonists was the Stamp Act. This is a direct tax. Sometimes we call this an excise tax, a tax on a specific good, on any paper goods. Okay, now you might think, okay, well, you write a letter and you have to pay an extra tax on it. What's the big deal there? But this is every paper good. So this is the newspaper you're paying an extra tax on. This is, sending that letter. This is a pamphlet you might have to print. You have to pay an additional tax on it. Even playing cards. If you wanted to go buy some playing cards, the price just went up because of the Stamp Act. So not a huge tax as far as the money that people had to pay, more of just a huge annoyance. Colonists were just seeing the prices of things that they had usually bought just go up and up and up. And then also we have on here is the Quartering Act. This was another really huge annoyance for the colonists. The British government basically would say, okay, this soldier is now going to live with you, and you have to do the cooking, the cleaning, you have to give him a bed, you have to, take his shoes off, all this kind of stuff that like colonists really didn't want to do. There's not a whole lot of hatred for the British government until these things go into effect. And so the British government kind of shoots itself in its own foot. It says, we want to collect the taxes to protect these colonists from the French and the Indian War. But what they're actually doing is making the colonists more and more upset. What this leads to is a group of colonists that say, enough is enough. We need to come up with an organization. And one of the leaders of that organization is a guy named Samuel Adams. Samuel Adams is a brewer, but the brewery Samuel Adams beer is not his company. So it's a little confusing, but he comes up with a group called the Sons of Liberty. This is going to be a secret group. They're going to meet in secret. They're going to have code words and all this kind of stuff. And what they're going to do is protest these British goods. They're first do a boycott, which if you don't know what the word boycott means, it is a protest where you specifically don't buy something to as an act of protest, right? So the colonists here under the Sons of Liberty's protest say, we're not going to buy these British-made goods. That's going to hurt the British government more than it's going to hurt us. That's the idea, at least. Now, if you're not buying tea, that means you have to kind of worry about where you're getting your clean water from, because many large cities in this time period, the big reliance on tea was that to make tea, you have to boil water. And by boiling water, you're making water clean, clean to drink and consume. So if you're not making tea, then you kind of just have to boil water and then drink hot water or drink beer, which again, Samuel Adams. So this boycott is not as easy as it sounds, right? Colonists have to dedicate themselves to not buying British-made goods. In response to this, Parliament actually does something that's pretty good. They repeal the Stamp Act. And so this is where the colonists, the British government says, well, if we repeal the Stamp Act, then they'll calm down. But that actually, again, is where the British government gets this wrong. The colonists realize, hey, we're powerful. Like, we got them to repeal the Stamp Act. And so they feel empowered. They feel emboldened. They feel like they can keep doing things. This is where we start to see this really important cry that the Sons of Liberty come up with, which is no taxation without representation. Basically, they're saying, look, we don't really mind the taxes. The problem we have is we can't vote on what the taxes are going to, and we have no control over what the taxes are levied on. So the colonists might have said, look, if you want to increase the tax on beer, like, we could go for that. But you did a stamp tax or a Stamp Act, and then you did, you know, all these other writs of assistance things, which were very unpopular. So that slogan becomes like a huge slogan for the colonists. It kind of rhymes, but I won't give them too many bonus points for that. So again, skipping over the videos, but you guys can watch that. The beginnings of the rebellion here, the Townshend Act is another miscalculated thing that the British government does. It is a direct tax on paint, glass, paper, and tea. I put paint in there twice. Don't worry about it. Paint only got taxed once. And the colonists are angered by this, right? So tea is being taxed. So the British government is saying, yes, you're relying on your tea. Pay us more money now for the tea. And the colonists are like, this is outrageous. So again, that's where the slogan, no taxation without representation, gets, you know, more and more people saying it. And then in Boston, Massachusetts, which, you know, a lot of things are going to happen in Boston, and it feels like there's just a bunch of angry colonists there. The big reason why stuff happens in Boston is because it is a port, and all of these taxes on all these goods, they're goods that are coming into the port in Boston. So Boston is going to have an increased number of troops sent there because there are angry people there. And all that does is really kind of fan the flames. The colonists see more and more troops, and they get more and more agitated. Also, more and more troops in the city means the colonists have to put up more and more soldiers with the Quartering Act that I mentioned previously, right? Go back here. There we go. So the more soldiers there are, the more soldiers are in people's homes. And the more soldiers are in people's homes, the more angry the colonists get. This is where the British government really doesn't have a good read on this situation at all. Part of the problem, again, with that is the distance. The British government is 3,000 miles away, and it's a couple weeks by traveling on a boat. So any kind of like things that go wrong, it's going to take a while to get back to Britain. And when you're dealing with like people that are angry, a swift response would be effective, but a response that comes weeks and weeks later, not super effective. So what we're going to study in class here is this event called the Boston Massacre. Okay, you'll get some primary sources in class and some secondary sources as well, written by historians. The basics of the event here, it happens on March 5th, 1770. We'll talk more about the specifics of what happens here, but essentially, and this might sound kind of odd, is that there's snowballs in March, but you have to remember this is in Boston, and it gets cold up there. But snowballs, I want to clarify as well, this isn't a snowball fight. This is like the colonists took rocks and put snow on top of it and then threw it at the British soldiers. So what we have here is colonists assaulting, if you want to say officers or soldiers, you know, they're throwing things at them. They're assaulting them. Not like shooting them, but what happens is one of the soldiers hears the word fire and shoots into the crowd of protesters. And so 9 British soldiers shoot into a crowd, killing 5 people. The first who is pronounced dead was a guy named Crispus Attucks, who is a free black colonist. And this is also a point in which I'll mention that Boston had a large free black population. I think it's often common to think that in the colonial times, most black people lived in the South and were slaves, but this is a healthy reminder that many black colonists were in the North and were free. It's also worth pointing out because many times when we talk about the events of the American Revolution, we think about people like George Washington and Paul Revere and those kinds of things. And this is to say that the first person killed in the Revolution is a black American, which is a certain weight of contribution to this whole event. The Sons of Liberty go on this huge propaganda campaign where they call this the Boston Massacre. Okay. Now, by modern standards, if 5 people were killed by soldiers, we probably wouldn't call that a massacre. But the Sons of Liberty don't care about the definition of massacre. They want people to feel. They don't want people to think. They want people to feel that they are being unjustly killed. And you have to think as well, a soldier getting hit with a snowball and returning fire with a musket, the colonists are going to say that is outrageous. That is, excessive use of force and all those kind of modern phrases we see in similar scenarios. So that's the Boston Massacre. Paul Revere, who is famous for his Midnight Ride, is actually doing something before that. And it is that he is making this picture, which he was not there for this event. So he's hearing about the event and saying, I'm just going to whip up a picture of my own to describe what happened. And we'll talk about this in class, but his picture is extremely misleading. Again, he doesn't care about the facts. He is trying to get people to feel that this is an injustice. So that's why he publishes this. I'm not going to criticize his artwork. I could definitely not do this, but I will criticize the accuracy of his artwork. So let's skip the video. Okay, skipping the video. We'll watch that in class. It's a good one. In response to this, the colonists unite. So Sons of Liberty are mostly in Boston. They decide to reach out to their friends in Virginia, which is the second, or Virginia, I believe, is the largest colony in the 13 colonies. And what they do here is create something called the Committees of Correspondence, just a network of letters that they're exchanging. Those in Massachusetts are saying, look, we had people killed in the Boston Massacre, and the people in Virginia are like, that's outrageous. We need to start doing stuff. And so this creates a communications network. It's pretty effective in uniting the colonists. And it lets colonists know that, like, if things are bad in their colony, they're also bad in other colonies. And so that's where you got to start thinking, like, hey, these colonies need to stick together and act as one. Boston Tea Party, another big event in Boston. I do want to point out, this is 1773, so this is 3 years after the Boston Massacre. But the Sons of Liberty plan a boycott, not just a boycott, but a destruction of property. Okay, they're going to dump what is the amount, I believe, of millions of dollars worth of British tea into the Boston Harbor. And they dress up as Native Americans to do this. There's a lot of speculation on why they did this, partially to protect their identity, partially to make the British feel inferior to the Native Americans, which has always been a point of controversy. But this is just straight up destruction of property to protest the events that happened. Now, this is, again, not a direct response to the Boston Massacre because it's 3 years later. Okay, those feelings are still there, and a lot of the people that were affected by the Boston Massacre are still in the city of Boston. But this event is not super connected to that. It's more connected to the taxes that are still on tea. Okay. Also worth pointing out that North Carolina has a tea party called the Edenton Tea Party. North Carolina was definitely not as big as places like Massachusetts, but we also had a protest against British tea. Now, King George III, we haven't talked about him a bunch, but he is also known as Mad King George. Not mad as in angry, but mad as in like the British context of like crazy. He had a disease called porphyria that really messed with his brain. And so he is suffering from a mental illness. It's a physical illness as well, while all of this is going on. And that is not a great combination to have the leader of what is probably the largest country by landmass in the world at this time. That leader is suffering from mental and physical illness, and there's colonists that are saying, we want out. So he tells Parliament to do stuff, and they don't want to do certain things. And what Parliament does do is they close the Boston Harbor. They think that will at least prevent another protest happening there. And that is where things escalate even more, because the British are also going to send in more troops. As I've said before, more troops in the city means that there is going to be more quartering of those soldiers to the people of Boston. And they don't like that. No one likes, cleaning a soldier's clothes and cooking an extra meal because they're not getting reimbursed for that. They're having to cook food for a random person who might have even shot someone in Boston in this Boston Massacre that happened earlier. So the colonists are going to come together and form something called the First Continental Congress. This is in September of 1774, so it's a year after the Tea Party, and it's 4 years after the Boston Massacre. 56 delegates, quite a few from all different colonies, are going to come together in Philadelphia, and they're going to say, look, we need to do something, so let's write a letter to the king. Let's try and use reason here. We don't want any more colonists getting killed, and we certainly don't want the government of Britain to be mean to us anymore. So they write a letter to the king, and the king basically ignores them. And in the meantime here, they're going to start to form militias. But I really want to point out here that the first meeting here, this First Continental Congress, there are not talks of independence happening. That is not on the radar. The colonists are simply asking for the British government to see reason, to not be stupid about things, and to back off, okay? It's when they get ignored, and we'll get into that in 1.3, that's where they start talking about independence. So here is where we leave off, talking about the militias and the Minutemen. You probably know this, but the Minutemen got their name because they were supposed to be ready at a minute's notice. So if the British soldiers came through, the Minutemen would get some kind of, someone would ring a bell, or there would be some kind of guy like Paul Revere who would give out an early warning. And then the militiamen or the Minutemen would grab their rifles, which were contraband. So a lot of them had hidden them in different places, and then be ready to fight. Okay. Worth pointing out that, again, this is a militia. This is super unorganized. There's no training. There's no pay. Guys showed up like wearing what this guy's wearing, just regular clothes. There's no uniforms yet. So this is all very unprofessional and very uncoordinated at this point. All right. Thanks for watching. And we will get to some questions in class on this. I don't have our review questions like we did for